Hey guys, Shah here, and today we are taking our first official glimpse at World of Warcraft Shadowlands. Well, I guess beta. I've been spending a fair bit of time playing on the beta, while also trying to figure out and find the time to get all my dailies and shit in order on live servers before the new expansion hits. And now that BFA is at its end with the pre-patch being introduced on the PTR, I'm getting more and more excited for the new expansion. Before the expansion comes out, I do want to get my foot in the door and really crack down on everything about the new dungeons because they are super rad and I've really been enjoying them so far. I wanted to take the time to look at each dungeon, break them down, and how several of the mechanics work, and hopefully later on I can introduce some routes and guides to the dungeons going into Season 1 of Shadowlands. We're going to start with the Necrotic Wake since it is the first dungeon you will be able to experience once you are out of the Maw, essentially, or once you have beta. Without spoiling anything besides, the entire dungeon, you will become aware of this dungeon during your time playing through the first Shadowlands zone, which is Bastion. Long story short, Maldraxxus raids Bastion for anima, and this dungeon is you and your group fighting with the Bastion forces, pushing back the Maldraxxus army. But we're not here to talk about the boring stuff. I do want to talk about the mechanics and jump right in. But first and foremost, I do want to, congratulate or thank Blizzard's art team for designing such an amazing dungeon. Actually, all the dungeons for that matter. Aesthetically, they're just great. There's no complaints here. On the other hand, there are some design philosophies that I have a little bit of a gripe with, but we're going to get into that subject later. Save it for a different day. When starting the dungeon, you will be facing into a room full of enemy forces, and do not worry, you're probably going to have to clear all of it. There are a few mobs in this room you're going to want to be aware of. Side note, when I'm walking through these dungeons, I am clearly coming from a tank perspective, but I think this knowledge will be useful for any spec or role. I'm going to be covering almost every ability that I have gone up against so far. So most mobs in this dungeon can be pretty scary, surprisingly. Blizzard is definitely trying to bring back this old school style dungeon where CC is extremely vital and coordination will be a key factor in your group's success when it comes to Mythic Plus. I was surprised to even see a normal dungeon to present as many complications as I saw, which may just be tuning issues, but let's dive into the mechanics of these pulls. Patchwork soldiers will be the first thing that you encounter in this dungeon and will not be the last. These mobs provide very little threat to your group and are something you could probably tackle with another mob. Zul'Ramis Gatekeepers, on the other hand, are not going to be that. They are going to be a mini boss style mob. There are going to be 3 of them, and you must kill all 3 to continue into the dungeon. They cast a generic spell called Necrotic Bolt that will typically target the tank for some light magic damage. They will also cast and channel an uninterrupted ability called Wrath of Zul'Ramis, which is a group-wide, semi-avoidable group damage. Lastly, they cast an ability called Clinging Darkness, that is a damage over time effect that stacks in severity until it's almost unhealable. Dispelling this will cause it to jump to a new target, but refreshing the stacks. Healers just want to make sure they're dispelling this on CD or as often as you feel like you need to. The amount of stacks you let this go to totally depends on your group. While fighting a Gatekeeper, small adds will continuously spawn from the portal. Just cleave these down and all should be well. This might be a good time to mention that with the launch of Shadowlands, many of the abilities are now target capped between 5 and 8 targets, with a few exceptions. In order to maximize your group damage, you will want to pull a good amount of mobs, but never too much that your group can't handle it. 2 more mobs that you will see in this room are Stitch Vanguards and Corpse Harvesters. Stitch Vanguards have a stacking frenzied buff that can be soothed by Druids, Hunters, and Rogues with the incorporation of Shiv back into their toolkit. They also cast a mini tank buster ability called Bone Claw that will cause you to take a little bit more damage with each application. This can be dodged, so if it is so, it does not apply the debuff. Lastly, they will channel Meat Shield. This gives them a minor absorb stacking the longer they channel it for. Basically, don't run with Boomkins, Locks, or Shadow Priest if you ever want to finish the dungeon. If you don't want this trash to take forever, I can imagine this not only being the kill target, but also a spell kick priority. On beta, these mobs can be stunned. Corpse Harvesters will cast Throw Flash at random targets, doing minor damage, and cast a channeled ability called Drain Fluids, which will incapacitate the target. This should be interrupted or stunned in some way. These mobs are more annoying than really anything else. Alright, boss time. Bladeborn is going to be your worst nightmare and probably the single most reason I am even making this video in the first place. The boss mechanics are pretty straightforward, at least I thought they were. He will cast a tank buster ability called Crunch, if that wasn't obvious. He will then target a player with Heaving Wretch. This is a frontal cone ability that has targeted a random player, which will follow the player until casted. So please, for the love of God, stop playing Spin the Corpse. Upon this cast finish, it will spawn 2 adds. These adds must be stunned and killed. Must be stunned and killed. They cast Blood Gorge, which does extremely light damage, but that's the least of your worries. If these adds don't die in a timely manner, they will explode, applying a debuff, which does an insane amount of damage every 2 seconds for 30 seconds, stacking. If you see a Carrion Eruption go off, might as well just wipe it up. Lastly, Blightbone will cast Fetid Gas, which is if it wasn't already self-explanatory, it's just an area of effectability that shouldn't be stood in, the classic don't send fire mechanic. This will then leave behind a pool that will do damage over time to anyone standing in the pool, so be mindful of floor space. First boss, check. Once this encounter has ended, you will continue up the stairs towards the most insufferable trash ever created. Here you're going to face a Zul'Ramis Necromancer who essentially will be the only kill target since all raised dead are unkillable until he dies. Good news is when the Necromancer dies, so will all of its minions. The Bridal Bone adds near the Necromancer do as little as cast Frostbolt at random targets and melee the tank, so prioritize the Necromancer over everything else. Necromancers will also cast Grim Fate at a random party member. This player just needs to practice social distancing from any other party member before the debuff expires. It also does an area of effect damage based on the mitigation. Their Animate Dead spell then will spawn additional mobs. Don't worry about these as much. Just make sure the tank is grabbing threat and continue targeting the Necromancer. Following this pull, Blight Bags are low-level threat mobs that when killed will apply a debuff to party members that will cause damage over time. This is a disease spell, so it can be cleansed by classes like Monk, Priest, and Paladins, but you should just let the healer catch up once these debuffs are out, and then let them fall off. There are a few more mobs in this entire area heading up to the second boss, so to just cover all of them as effectively as possible, I'm just going to go through each one. You're going to see a variety of them through different pulls. Zul'Ramis Sorcerers are a healer's worst nightmare. Their signature spammable ability called Necrotic Bolt will target the tank or whatever player has threat. It does moderate magic damage and also applies a healing absorb debuff. If this cast goes uninterrupted, your tank will perish quite quickly. I feel bad for any tank that can't self-heal, actually. They will also cast a spell called Shadow Well. If I'm being honest, I have no idea what this spell does, and I'm going to be taking a guess based off the spell animation. It leaves an area of denial that when stood in, it does moderate damage to players. Even when I purposely stood in this, there was no tooltip for the text, but according to Wowhead, players standing in this cannot be healed, and it also erupts for magic damage every few seconds. In a similar pull like this, you're going to see Narzuda, which is a mini-boss style mob similar to the Necromancer from earlier. Outside of casting Necrotic Bolt and Grim Fate like the Necromancer, he also casts a spell called Shared Agony, which links two players together. This is a stacking debuff which deals damage over time, and the only way to remove it is by distancing yourselves. So I'm not sure if it can be cheesed by an all-range group, but what kind of meta is triple range, am I right? Lastly, this punk-ass casts Dark Shroud, which makes him immune to physical damage, another reason to bring all range classes. Am I right? Another two enemy forces that you're going to see in this area, and the area ahead will include Zul'Ramis Bone Carvers and Zul'Ramis Bone Menders. The Bone Carvers only really seem to cast one ability, but it's good to be aware of the effects. Bone Flay is that ability and is a mini tank buster similar to Shield Bash abilities from Ataldazar back in BFA, but this ability also applies a bleed and reduces your maximum health by 30%. Note, this can be dodged, so you can drop it, but I'm not sure if this debuff can stack, since there are never really two Bone Carvers in a single pack, and then this ability, like I mentioned, can be dodged. So any dodge-based tank like Druid or Monk should have an easier time with these mobs than other tanks. The Bone Menders are pretty straightforward. They mend, bones. They will cast Bone Mend, which is a light heal to their allies. Once they hit a certain health threshold, they will actually cast Final Bargain, which causes them to heal to 80% of their maximum health, but then lose 4% of it every second, while also pulsing damage onto the group. So be sure you try to stun this. I'm not sure if stunning it will actually cause it to just recast once the stun ends, but you can be sure to lock that cast down. It cannot be kicked, though. It is a shielded ability. Another enemy that is important for the entire group to be aware of is the Skeletal Marauder. They have a single cast on a 15-second duration, so one melee kick should be enough to handle it. If this kick is missed, everyone caught within the radius will be feared. Shamans are finally useful. Yay! Melee and range alike will want to be aware of these mobs and where they are facing, since they have pretty heavy-hitting Gruesome Cleave, which will hit in a frontal cone facing the tank. So tanks need to face these mobs away from the group, and melee, don't stand on the fucking tank, please. You will see a handful of these mobs throughout the dungeon, and then finally, the last mini-boss in here I would consider to be the Skeletal Monstrosity. This monstrosity will cast a few abilities in a certain sequence. Typically, it will cast the ability Shatter on the tank, which is a moderate damaging ability, which also applies a 20% damage taken debuff, which stacks. It will then cast Reaping Winds, which causes AoE frost damage and will slow anyone caught within the range to be slowed by 60%, which can be problematic for the ability Grave Spikes. This will cause 5 swirls to appear, indicating where spikes will shoot out of the ground and do physical damage to anyone caught within and knock the player into the air. Honestly, I like this mob a lot. It's the perfect amount of ugly. You will see these mobs in different clusters all the way up to the second boss platform, and once you get there, don't be scared. Blue Lady just kills all the mobs for you, so you can just get right into the boss fight. Marth is a pretty straightforward boss and doesn't seem to cause too many issues. I'm hoping they tuned him up a bit, since at least on this difficulty it seemed really boring. Maybe it's because I'm a druid and completely remove one mechanic from the fight, but first things first, he will cast Necrotic Bolt, which by now you will be tired of. This ability can be kicked, so most likely you'll want a kick rotation. He also casts Unholy Frenzy, which can be soothed by a druid, hunter, or rogue. He will then periodically cast Land of the Dead, which spawns 3 enemy mobs similar to necromancers from earlier. You will want to blow these up as quickly as possible. It's just a slight annoyance that most of the mobs are casters, so it's difficult to maximize your cleave here. Maybe if you had just a full range group. Marth will then cast Final Harvest after a short time, causing the minions he spawned to explode, doing group-wide shadow damage. Once this cast goes off, he gains a buff called Tortured Echoes, which does minor shadow damage to your group every 3 seconds. This wasn't even noticeable at this difficulty, but I can imagine it will serve as a softened range in higher key levels. Once you defeat this boss, it's role-playing time. It takes a grand total of 17 seconds for the Blue Angel ladies to fly down and land, followed by another 16 seconds of flying. Honestly, the biggest wait's at 33 seconds. If this seems like a minor annoyance, it is. Just wait until you're up against the timer. Once you land in the spooky ship, it's time for the best trash ever. You will need to clear the entire room before you can engage the boss. However you pull this room is entirely up to you. First things first, you'll see patchwork soldiers in this room. Again, they don't pose much of a threat, so feel free to just cleave them down while facing other mobs. And then you have a handful of different mobs in here. You have about 4 or so. So first, we have the Flesh Crafters. The two abilities that they cast, the group needs to look out for. First is Throw Cleaver, which is targeted at a random player and is easily the most frustrating as a tank, because it seems that most people don't realize that it will target anyone, but can be intercepted by the first target hit. So either stand still or make sure your tank is in front of it. Repair Flesh will need to be interrupted in some way, because it heals a nearby construct for a percentage of their maximum health every second for 8 seconds. Kick this ASAP. There are 2 Tank Buster mobs in here. You have Loyal Creations and Kyrian Stitchwork. The Loyal Creations will cause moderate physical damage to the tank and cast Spine Crush, which is a physical damage AoE. I've also seen these guys in Rage, but I don't know what cast causes it. They should just be soothed as soon as it is noticed. The Kyrian Stitchwork severely punishes the tank, causing them to take increased damage every time they cast their ability Tenderize. This debuff stacks, so tanks need to be careful. It's a 15% increased damage per stack. Luckily, this can be dodged and reset. They will also cast Mutilate, which is just heavy physical damage, which in combination with Tenderize can make for some pretty heavy tank healing requirements. Lastly, you have your Corpse Collectors, which mainly is on the group to lock down, since the tank might just be a little busy with those 2 Tank Buster mobs. Drain Fluids will inflict a plague damage over 4 seconds during the duration of the channel to the juiciest party member. It will also cast Gore Splatter, and then this ability is a disease that is applied to all party members, causing direct damage upon application and damage over time during its duration. Having players who can dispel this will be important, but I would imagine this needs to be kicked at all costs. Once you finish this room, there will be more RP while you wait for enemies to spawn. Surgeon Stitchflesh spawns 2 assistants who repeat similar abilities to those of the Corpse Collector and the Flesh Crafter. Upon the spawning of the Stitching Assistant and the Separation Assistant, they will both cast Throw Cleaver, which should be soaked by the tank if possible. The Stitching Assistant will then cast Drain Fluids and Throw Flesh. The Separation Assistant will cast Separate Flesh on the tank for moderate physical damage. Its signature ability will be Morbid Fixation, which causes him to fixate players chasing them and causing severe physical damage if caught. Again, range meta? Once both of these enemies are defeated, you can finally start the boss encounter. Oh wait, I lied. You will now need to fight 2 more boss-style mobs called Goregrind, who will do similar abilities such as the Kyrian Stitchwork and the Loyal Creations. In addition, he will also target a member in melee and cast Gut Slice, which is a frontal cone which if hits applies a bleed effect. There will be some patchwork soldiers and leftovers to help your DPS feel a little bit bigger on the DPS meters, but killing Goregrind will be the priority, and then once he is defeated, head over to the other end of the room where you will fight Rotspew. Same story here. Once you see Stitchflesh's creation, you are ready to finally begin the boss fight and be ready to be absolutely annoyed. This mob will cast Mutilate. Just be sure to have mitigation up for this. Embalming Ichor will be cast from the boss, which will be cast on a random member of the group, causing a green swirl to appear, which should be avoided, obviously. And then this will leave a small area of denial. During all of this, the Surgeon will be casting Stitch Needle, which applies a physical debuff to members doing damage over time. This seems to be slightly overtuned for the difficulty, but we'll have to see once we can jump into the Mythic and above. The ability here is Meat Hook. This is the big one, which will target a random player. This ability is used to grapple the Surgeon off of his platform. This ability has a bit of a charge up, and the player targeted needs to be between the creation and the surgeon before the channel begins. Once the channel begins, it will grip the surgeon down, where he will then be able to be damaged. This fight punishes the group pretty hard if Meat Hook is missed, since the creations are going to keep spawning. So if the surgeon isn't brought down, your tank will get overrun, and this fight will last until patch 9.1. Once the surgeon is down, he will cast a tank buster called Sever Flesh. Surprise, surprise, tank players, just mitigate. The boss will eventually jump back onto the platform after 30 seconds, so players will want to capitalize their damage while he is vulnerable. Now, something interesting that may be a bug is that if he is caught in the meat hook, his escape timer is reset back to 30 seconds. So continue landing the meat hooks to prevent him from escaping. Because this is beta, this may be a bug and not intentional, but if it does go live, this will be a crucial element to the timer to keep him down as long as possible, since you've already wasted 33 seconds on Blue Boy RP. This is a bit of a boss rush at the end of a pretty heavy trash dungeon. Now that the surgeon is defeated, you head straight up to the pinnacle of Zul'Ramis to face Thor the Rhinebinder. I would consider this fight pretty straightforward, but I'm sure it's confusing to most DPS because of the mini event that they have to endure. I don't have footage of the event, but I can explain it, I think. So Thor is a pretty spooky end boss due to the high level of magic damage that the tank and the group will be taking. His primary ability is called Icy Shard, which does frost damage. Most tanks can't mitigate magic too well, so do what you can here. Thankfully, we do have spell queuing, so there will be recovery time. Frozen Binds is pretty frequent. Cassie does every 25 seconds, so which is going to root a player, and upon dispelling, will root every player caught within the radius for 12 seconds. So healers, please don't fucking dispel instantly, and druids, just don't even think about shifting. The root is problematic mainly for melee range meta, but if stuck in roots during Comet Storm, any DPS will perish. This is a channeled ability casted every 20 seconds or so that will call down ice shards from the sky. Simply just move around to avoid screwing over any of your party members. Luckily, during most of this, one player will be exiled, so you will have a lot more floor space to work with. Before I talk about the minigame that the DPS players have to endure, the last ability Thor will cast is called Icebound Aegis, which is a small absorb shield, which will radiate frost damage to all members until the shield is broken. This happens pretty frequently, enough where it's not worth holding CDs for, but will require DPS players to make sure they are maximizing their DPS at all moments of the encounter. Alright, Dark Exile. This ability seems to confuse a lot of players, and I will do my best to describe what needs to happen. So Thor will exile a member of the group, prioritizing DPS. This will transport the player to the lowest platform, where the player will need to complete an obstacle course of falling ice and blizzard AoE effects. They will need to run about 30 yards of these annoyances and save Blue Boy, and in order to come back up to the boss encounter. If hit by any abilities down below, you will be slowed, which obviously causes huge potential problems to any player who is in a rogue or druid. The faster the player can get through the minigame, the better, since the Icebound Aegis is preferably destroyed as soon as humanly possible. And another thing I should mention is that a player only has about 45 seconds to make it through the hurdles, or if not, they will be killed instantly. This is pretty much a rinse and repeat kind of encounter with pretty predictable spell queues. And that's it. That's the dungeon. One and done. Holy shit, what a video. Fuck, 20 minutes? I'm sorry, boys and girls. A few quick things I do want to mention before I cut this clip. I found a few cool engaging mechanics within the dungeon that I do want to go over, but I don't want this video to be 30 minutes long, so I will cover that in a future one. Also, this is still beta, so there are a lot of things that can change, and if anything does, I will have an updated guide. Looking down the road, I would love to do this for every dungeon, so if that is something you are interested in, please hit that thumbs up and subscribe button thingy. You know where it is. So I know you're interested in seeing more content like this. I do plan on doing strats, talking about optimizing routes and other little tips and tricks as they are discovered, and especially once I can start jumping into some of the Mythic Plus testing and or when the content is live. I hope you all enjoyed this. I hope you're all staying healthy, and I will catch you guys in the next one. Take care.